This podcast, The Final Frontier. These are the voyages of a bunch of nerds who've got internets, speakers, microphones, and want to talk to you about Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Guys, I'm so excited. I wanted to do a Star Trek themed episode for the longest time. I know a lot of you guys absolutely love this, and as a fellow nerd and aficionado of Star Trek, I couldn't be more excited to bring to you two guys who I just know have just this wealth of information. Robert Greene II and Eric Leonard. Rob, as you probably know, he's been on the podcast a few times, is an assistant professor at Claflin University, and writes about a whole bunch of stuff. Rob's easy to find. And this is Eric's first time on the pod. I actually climbed a mountain with him back in September. He actually is also a historian, but he has served a 25-year service with the National Park Service. So you can find both of these guys on Twitter. Eric is a source of information, especially if you want to learn about like national parks and how they operate and so forth. Maybe learn a little bit more about what historians do, maybe a different capacity. Eric is that dude. But today we're talking about Star Trek and the end of the Cold War and what Star Trek VI has to say about aging, going before our time, the early 90s, what Star Trek had to say when you've got the original cast on a big screen and the next generation cast on the small screen. And what's the fandom have to say? What's the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars? Is it even fair to make those comparisons? This is such a fun conversation because these guys are absolute experts. And I like Star Trek, but I've always been a Star Wars guy, and I kind of feel wary about that analogy. But we're going to talk about Star Trek VI today. I actually asked them which film to do, and they were like, let's do VI, actually, of all things. And you'll hear them talk about why today, while we're starting with VI versus, say, Khan, or the one with the whale, or anything else like that. But I hope to come back. And we end up talking about, I think, all the Star Trek films, and I'm talking the new ones, the next generation ones. We talk about Deep Space Nine, all over the place. Talk about Strange New Worlds, which I actually love. I think it's terrific. This is a lot of fun. These are two guys who are absolute buddies of mine. So we had a blast talking about this. If you're into Star Trek, if you like talking about the Cold War, trying to figure out how to like bring film into your courses and maybe a different kind of movie to talk about the fall of the Soviet Empire, this is maybe one you want to consider. So strap in. We're about to go where, well, a bunch of us have boldly gone before. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Rob, Eric, welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm so glad you guys can make it in tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm really glad to be here again.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is my first time on the pod, long-time listener, and I look forward to talking history and Star Trek.
This could be a lot of fun, right? Because I was like, we really at some point in time need to do a Star Trek film on HATM. There's nobody really kind of comes up in our age group who hasn't been affected, whether or not they're a fan of Star Trek. Star Trek has this just super huge influence on pop culture, the way we understand the past. I think well, hopefully we'll get to that. And you guys are such big fans of Star Trek. I like Star Trek, but you guys are like in on it, which is for me exciting to be able to just kind of prompt you guys with stuff. Because one of the cool things I like so much about Star Trek is like there's this built-in history of Star Trek and all this meta stuff that it's trying to do that I can't explain, and that I know that you guys can definitely delineate because I've talked to you about at length. I want to say ad nauseum. That sounds wrong, but like at length, before. So before we get in, so for our listeners here on HATM podcast who have not met you guys yet before, why don't you guys tell us who you are and like what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Robert Greene II. I'm an assistant professor of history at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And I'm also one of the senior editors for Black Perspectives and publications chair for the Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians.
I'm Eric Leonard. I'm a 25-year veteran of the United States National Park Service, practitioner in public lands and public history, and presently the superintendent at Guadalupe Mountains National Park in far west Texas, but preparing a move. And obligatory note here, of course, is my views on history and Star Trek are mine alone. They do not reflect any national park that I might have worked at or will work at in the future. And they do not reflect the views of the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, or the United States federal government.
Oh, man. I actually have so many questions. Like right now, just thinking about this is like, I'm desperate to ask, like, how is the national parks like reflected in Star Trek at some point? Like, there's got to be some kind of like, is there like fanfic? I'm like, whoa, wait. Is it in the Final Frontier where Kirk is climbing? I don't know, but we'll get into that in a sec. So, and then with like Strange New Worlds, like Pike is like riding his horse. Oh man, this is gonna get deep fast. All right, first, most significant and most important question we can ask you guys: Coke or Pepsi? Where's your allegiance?
Coke. Is it okay, though, to have mixed feelings about Coke Zero?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You got to declare a side. You don't have to like it.
Well, I guess being from Georgia, I have to say Coke as well.
Yeah, you do. And that, my friends, is why I am drinking a Dos Equis. All right, so our first most important question. Did Star Trek, The Undiscovered Country, kill Gene Roddenberry?
No, he was already sick.
Okay. Because he died, he saw this movie and he died 2 days later, right?
Yeah. But you bring up an important point in that by the time of the production of the film, Roddenberry's not a fan of the writer-director involved in this film. Mm-hmm. You know, they have very different visions, and Roddenberry was ill, and he'd been long ago pushed into a executive producer, which means they had to show it to him. He was involved, but his creative input could be contained.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to kind of branch off of there, because for many Star Trek fans, even those who love Star Trek 6, they always point to it as being one of the earliest examples of Trek as a franchise going away from Gene Roddenberry alone as a sole influence and trying to embrace other influences. And as Eric mentioned, the writer-director in question is Nicholas Meyer, who mm-hmm. famously worked on Star Trek II as well, and became a beloved part of the Trek universe, so to speak, despite himself admitting he was never really a Star Trek fan. And I think many argue that his lack of Trek fandom is what helped him make two of the most beloved Trek films ever made, Star Trek II and Star Trek VI. But certainly Roddenberry passing away when he did, there is a symbolism there of Trek going beyond the quote-unquote Roddenberry vision, whatever that means. And that means different things to different people.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to this idea, and I hope we can kind of touch on where Star Trek is now at some point in time, as far as whether it's still falling within the idea of Roddenberry's vision. But so Rob, I reached out to you initially. I was like, "Hey, I want to do a Star Trek film. What do you want to do?" And you were immediately like, "Let's do 6." And I kind of felt like you might say 2 or maybe 4. In my head, 6 might have also been there. Why 6? Why are we talking about, say, The Undiscovered Country is the first Star Trek film that we're talking about? Because there's a whole plethora of Star Trek films, series, fanfic, other stuff we could talk about. Why this one first?
Well, I think it's because of the fact that Star Trek as a franchise has always been lauded for using metaphor to talk about real-world issues. And yet Star Trek 6 is, I think, if you're talking about metaphor, it's metaphor as a sledgehammer. Because yes. If you watch Star Trek 6, well, you watched Star Trek 6 when it first came out. Even if you do nothing about Star Trek, if you watched it, you're thinking, I think this is about the end of the Cold War. And then by the end of it, you realize, yeah, this is about the end of the Cold War. So I think just for that alone, it's such an obvious metaphor for real-world issues that, as we're going to probably talk about later this evening, really reflect how, up until that point, Star Trek had... You really cannot separate Star Trek, at least its early years, from the Cold War, I would argue. And I think 6 really exemplifies that.
Do you think there's this idea of a closure of the original series to go along with the close, what we thought then, the close of the Cold War? Because this film comes out in, 91? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think that's really important, especially in hindsight. The Next Generation had started airing in 1987, and very famously, the original cast was almost hostile. They felt like they were being replaced. Now, we live in a moment where there are 5 Star Trek shows in production.
Right.
The universe is big enough for all of these things. And one of the roles that Six plays is it's talking about that transition out of the Cold War, but it's also a baton passing from the original cast. I agree with Robert in the sledgehammer, but the transition, and sort of the baton passing in this film is a little bit more nuanced, and than the sledgehammer of the next film, which is not great.
Really? You're not a fan of Generations? Okay, we'll get into that in a minute. Was Star Trek 6 necessary after the Final Frontier, after Star Trek 5?
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yes.
Why?
I think one way to look at it is they couldn't let the original series cast go out with Star Trek 5. There was just no way to let them do that. And okay. And I say this as someone who actually likes Star Trek 5, but the film itself there's a plethora of problems with it. I mean, the budget, they go way over budget. It's William Shatner's first and only directorial role as well, which I think hurt the film.
I don't know how he gets that job.
Well, I think in his defense, you can see the film has a vision to it. And going back to your Roddenberry question, it kind of fits in that Roddenberry vision of science versus religion, belief versus practicality, that kind of thing. But 5 was a box office failure. Many fans just did not like the film. And I think 6, in a way, was a mea culpa to the fan base saying, hey, we're going to get it right this time. And we're going to have a story that is a little bit more grounded than we're going to find God. Okay,
so with 6, we all agree 6 is one of the better Star Trek, at least of the original films. Where do we place this? There's traditionally the idea of the even and odd numbered films, right, within the Star Trek series, correct? 2, 4, and 6 are the good ones, and then 1, 3, and 5 are bad. Well, talk to me about this, because I don't want to overspeak in the Star Trek lore here. This is one of the more beloved films? No.
Star Trek 2 takes up most of the energy. 2 and 4 of the original series would be the ones that take up the energy. Now, personally, of the Star Trek films, this is my favorite. It's the one that it speaks to me. When I worked at Cold War nuclear, national park site, this really spoke to me, and it continues to be a very meaningful film personally. We can go into the full rankings later, but I like 2, and I do enjoy 2. I like 3 better. And when did I start liking 3 better? After I had children.
Okay, that's fair.
William Shatner is a hack actor, but when he reacts to the death of his son, oh my God, that is the best moment he's ever put on screen. It's just incredible. But it didn't speak to me until I had kids, and once I had kids, it just resonated with me.
I rewatched this movie this morning, and I'm watching Strengths and Weaknesses, and Shatner's acting definitely falls into one of those categories. But let's talk a little bit about the strengths of this film and some of the themes that this movie is kind of trying to talk about. We're talking about the end of the Cold War. There's also very much this sense of we've got, especially coming out of 5, we didn't send these guys off the right way. We really owe it to them to let them, the film ends in that second star to the right, straight out till morning, which is a great, perfect line to end this series on. Let's talk about the strengths of this movie. What is this movie trying to tell us? What is it doing? And what does it do well?
Building on what we were just talking about, even and odds, best and worst. At its core, Star Trek is a television show. It's really good at television. It's born in that genre. It plays to television's strengths. Big screen adaptations, quite frankly, are always going to be a little bit mixed, because they're longer. They tend, you're investing so much money, so you want to show it. So we'll talk later about J.J. Abrams and those damn screen flares. And whereas in this is one of the last film, this and Generations still have physical spaceship models, and so the special effects have a realism to them that feels quaint now.
Yeah, I would. I think one of the strengths of Star Trek 6, and this is not to sound like a smart aleck, I think one of its strengths is it comes between 5 and Generations. And so I think for a lot of Trek fans, it stands out because it
Wait, is it the bridge?
Well,
Yes.
Yeah, in several ways, yes.
Oh, I hit the
Unfortunately
metaphor.
for
Go
James
on.
T. Kirk, but I think it stands out because it's more beloved by fans than five or generations. I will say, as a kid, my favorite one was actually four because of the time travel element and being fish out of water and all that stuff. But I think six, as the years go by, six becomes more important because, to build off of Eric's point, I think it's also a film about aging in the sense of this generation is the first generation to see the potential of peace. And as they say in the film, it's the generation for which it'll be the hardest to adjust that new order, so to speak. And so the film really gets this idea of endings and new beginnings all at once.
What's interesting, Robert, is Star Trek II is also about aging, because in that one, Kirk is 50 and celebrates a birthday he's very ambivalent about. This is a little bit more nuanced in terms of, are they still relevant? What matters? And, there's the scene in between Kirk and Spock, which is just incredible, where "Are we a joke?" is literally one of the dialogue lines. And when you read the books written shortly after this film is released by Shatner and Nimoy, they both reflect on that scene and what it meant to them personally.
Can we talk about the age of the cast? I feel like watching this morning, I was kind of, and I've seen this film a few times, but like the age of the cast was really apparent to me on screen. I was kind of like, wow, it almost felt like they were beyond their time as actors on this role. Shatner had put on a ton of weight. It feels like he's got a bodysuit kind of weighing him in. He's a big fella in this film. Walter Koenig's hair is just unbelievable. Just let the man be bald is all I was asking. I had a hard time. Leonard Nimoy looked great. Leonard Nimoy looked fantastic, but the cast themselves seemed slow to me. I don't know. Am I wrong here? Right? Or is this a strength, a weakness? Like, what's our thoughts on the fact that they are very deliberately showing a very aging cast here into this film? And like you were just saying, much of this question is are we past our prime? Can we even do this anymore?
It's funny because if you go back to the motion picture in 1979, that film is set in the Trek universe only 2 or 3 years after the original series ends. And yet a lot of fans comment on that film as saying you can tell the cast is clearly a decade older, which, going back to Eric's point, is why Star Trek II is set so much further after the original series. So by 6, I think they're leaning more into this. This is their last hurrah, their last go around. In fact, I think in the original script for the film, they even make it clear that they aren't really in the same crew anymore. That they're all kind of doing their own separate things, and Kirk has to reassemble them for one last mission, which is cut out of the film. But it's kind of implied. Like, for example, there's the great line where Scotty says, "I just bought a boat," and all this stuff. And they're clearly, as Eric points out, they're clearly looking towards the future of the ends of their own retirements, except Sulu's a captain and all that. But yeah, you're right. The crew clearly shows its age in this movie.
One of the most important things about this film to me, you just said, Captain Hikaru Sulu of the USS Excelsior. That I scream over that. It's amazing. That was long, deserved. And I wish they'd done more with it. There's a Voyager episode a few years later for the 30th anniversary that, other than original series actors in it, it's not great. But let me own my bias. I'm not a fan of Star Trek Voyager particularly. Good premise, wasted.
We talked about this when I saw you.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
And we can get into my hot take, which is the Excelsior is a better ship than the Enterprise, but that's just me, or at least this iterate. Yeah, I'll say it. First of all, the Excelsior doesn't get blown up, so there's that.
Well, Ensign Christian Slater is pretty cool too.
He is. You got a hearing problem, mister? Like, Scylla was good, right? And it's one of the things that surprised me. Like, watching this was like, and you kind of wish they'd be able to do a little bit more. And I think that's actually one of the things that Strange New Worlds, the series that's going on right now, does when they introduce Pike, which is like Pike's been off doing his thing for a while. It's been out of touch. And it's surprising early on where you find out that, like, Kirk doesn't know that Spock's been an ambassador for the last little while. Like, these guys have not been together, and yet they're still being pulled together to go do this one last hurrah, right?
Well, and to speak to present day Trek and how these themes, one of the strengths of Trek is it hits universal themes over and over again. As we're recording this, the third season of Star Trek Picard is airing. Those Next Generation actors, the bulk of them are in their 70s. Sir Patrick Stewart is a little older. And there too, that setup, several of the characters have been absent for 20 years. And they, in this case, they're using the 10 episode format to really dive into what did that mean to those people? What changed in that time period? And that speaks to how Star Trek has evolved as delivery systems for television have changed. Mm-hmm. But again, allegory is a sledgehammer. One of the, mythologies about this movie that's true is Leonard Nimoy visited in Nicholas Meyer's house and suggested, well, what if the wall comes down in space? And they outlined the film in, within an hour.
It makes sense though, right?
Yeah.
And it also allows a significant level of backtracking to say, this is how Worf was able to be part of Starfleet.
Yes.
This brings up an interesting point, and I don't want to jump on Jason's point about Worf, but as I was thinking about our show this evening, this is actually Star Trek VI and The Next Generation being on at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. Star Trek VI comes out in November of 91. Next Generation is going to its 5th season at that point. It's a really interesting, we're talking about history here, history of Hollywood. It's an interesting example of a shared universe, because if you may know this, but around the time 6 comes out, The Next Generation does the 2-parter episode Unification, where Spock is in the Next Generation era almost 80 years later, and they even have Spock saying a line where telling Captain Picard, I don't want to have happen to you what happened to Captain Kirk with Kittimer. And fans were like, wait, what does that mean? So you almost had to go see 6 to see what Spock meant when he said that line, which I think is an interesting take on what Eric pointed out with using different systems of media deliveries than Star Trek, how they were already using the shared universe idea and don't really go back to it again for a while.
One of the other things I want to talk about, and this, Jason, this is part of your why Undiscovered Country. Klingons are the most famous, the most developed science fiction alien species, and Star Trek VI gives them at the time their highest profile examination, and is by turns really respectful of the race, the species, and then also hateful of them, which fits that wider allegory as Klingons as a proxy of the Soviet Union. That said, there's some interesting stories around the production of the film, and the actors Brock Peters and Nichelle Nichols are being given lines that are pretty ugly in terms of they're sharing how they feel about Klingons, and it's not great. And that's another point in which fans have a lot of contention of Star Trek's an aspirational universe. Humans are supposed to be better. Well, I would argue that humans are going to be human.
You're right.
And and an aspirational universe means you're always trying to be better. You sometimes don't meet the mark. And part of the strength of this film is William Shatner and James T. Kirk realize, wait, I could be better here than I am. And, and that adds value to the story and to the character, some really neat depth.
Well, that actually leads me to a question, which is, what's the most important moment in the film itself? Because when you say the idea of him saying, be better, first thing pops in my head is him saying, we surrender. That's so un-Kirk-like. Have we ever seen Kirk surrender? And he's like, no, we're not going to go to war, but we're trying to go to this peace, even though he doesn't like these dudes. My favorite scenes here are obviously Sulu showing up, but that's just me.
I think an important scene in the film is the assassination of Chancellor Gorkon that happens early in the film, where Kirk and McCoy, again, as General Chang, who's the main antagonist in the film, calls them Cold Warriors. They come on the ship to help the Chancellor, and Chancellor Gorkon tells Kirk, don't let it end this way. And I know, again, Shatner's acting sometimes leaves a lot to desire, but in that moment, you see Kirk's face of, oh man, we just blew it. Like he blew it, and we let this Klingon down. And I think you see in the film, as you guys have already alluded to, you see Kirk's attitudes on this go from a sense of duty of, okay, I have to do this, to he starts to actually believe this is the right thing to do. And I think you kind of see it beginning in that scene.
Yeah, there's a switch from like duty to opportunity, right? Like there's like a chance here. What do we think about Chang? Christopher Plummer as General Chang. Can you guys know Star Trek so much better than I do. Where do we place Chang on the Star Trek villain scale? Can we talk about him? Because he's got some of the best, for me, some of the most fun lines in all of Star Trek villainy. But what are your thoughts?
I think he's honestly, out of the Star Trek films, he's my favorite villain, even more than Khan, because I think the thing about General Chang that makes him so interesting, besides the use of Shakespeare and Shakespearean quotes and all of that, is he's sort of a mirror image of Kirk, if you think about it, where Kirk and Chang are both men who've been in the service for a long time. But you mentioned opportunity here, where Kirk sees an opportunity for peace, Chang sees an opportunity for war, and he takes advantage of that and tries to push it as much as he can. I think he's one of the great villains, and it helps that Plummer's acting is so, it's great, and yes, it is over the top, but it fits the character perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Something that Khan and Chang have in common is, and this is what puts Star Trek II and Star Trek VI in rare company. There's space battles, but there's no face-to-face. The villains are not shooting or punching each other, and that's a strength. Quite frankly, the physical confrontations with villains, especially in the original series films, they tend not to age well. Here, I'm looking at you, Star Trek III, a little bit, and Christopher Lloyd, but especially Star Trek V and the aborted rock monster that they couldn't technically pull off, and so the film clearly, Anyway,
so we're a plus on Chang. Is Chang your favorite of all Star Trek villains? Like, where do you place him versus other Star Trek, like in the rest of the world?
Well, I think for me, if you're talking about villains in both film and television, I think for me the question is, do you count Q as a villain or not from Next Generation? Because he's such an iconic character. And I think from Deep Space Nine, I think Gul Dukat is also up there as well.
Yeah.
But I think General Chang is, out of the original series films, I think, and I know this is going to be sacrilegious to a lot of Star Trek fans, I think Chang is a slightly better villain than Khan, only because of what he represents in the film in terms of being a parallel for Kirk and these ideas of peace versus war.
How do you feel about Nero? Moving forward let's go ahead and bring in J.J. Abrams into this. I want to talk about Eric Bana.
Wasted talent.
Not a fan.
I think the issue with those Abrams films, really the films from, I suppose from really Nemesis onward, is that Trek became way too reliant on the villain seeks revenge against the Federation or against the Enterprise. And I think Nero, again, Eric Bana is a good actor. And there are some really fun moments in the film with Nero, but on the whole, I think I agree with Eric. He's sort of a wasted character. He's more of a means to an end in that film. This is the difference between, I think, Chang and Nero. If you make Star Trek VI without Chang, it isn't Star Trek VI anymore. It just doesn't work as strongly as it does. Star Trek, if you take Nero out and put in another generic villain of the week, the movie likely still works. That's how I feel, at least, about it.
Well, and this raises a really important point, Jason. Again, looking at Star Trek II or Star Trek VI, the weakness. Well, Star Trek II is a great film. Fans love it. It is powerful. Back in January, I got to see Shatner live, and they did a restaging. I saw the first film for the first time in a theater with a surround sound in 40 years, and oh my God. The legacy of Star Trek II is they repeat the themes and parts of that story in, at this point, something like 4 different films.
Yeah, it doesn't. You're kind of beating a dead horse at some point in time.
Yeah.
But we one of you guys brought up the idea earlier, and I just kind of hammed it up about Star Trek 6 as a bridge to the next film, but a bridge between 5 and Star Trek Generations. And every time I say Star Trek Generations, Rob makes a huge face of amused disgust, is what I'm going to call it. Why don't we like Star Trek Generations? Because it felt like, well, I want to hear your thoughts on this. So especially I want to hear your thoughts on Shatner and the cast in the OG cast in Star Trek Generations. Like, why don't we like Generations?
Well, I think for one, the big problem with Generations is this, especially, again, relating to the history of Hollywood the last 30 years. You think about the fact that we've had so many films in the last 10 to 15 years that had crossovers, big, multiverse events, etc. Having James T. Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard in the same film should have been a much bigger deal than it was. And I think sometimes I'll watch Generations and forget they're both in the film together. Because while it was a big deal at the time, the way I think it was handled, it just didn't have the feel it should have had. And I think for a lot of Trek fans, really 30 years later now, it still leaves a sour taste in their mouths.
Yeah.
Do you not approve of the Shatner death or of the James T. Kirk death in Generations, or going out underneath a bridge just feels weak to me?
The whole thing is forced. The setup feels forced, and contrived. The murdering Picard's brother and nephew, feels unnecessary. It's just, It's forced, and you're watching the thing, and there are some good moments. My biggest pet peeve of the TNG movies, and the original series does this a little bit, is some of those minor characters. Well, a major minor character, Data, in the Next Generation films, this really nuanced, very interesting character gets turned into a one-liner delivery device, and it's terrible. Yeah. It's a waste of the actor, a waste of the character. And watching Nemesis in the theater, 20 years ago, I have this epiphany of, oh my God, they're finally writing him right. And, and about 5 minutes later, watching the movie, I'm like, oh no, I know what's coming. And, and that was a little maddening. I have a pet peeve about Star Trek 6 that's true of all of the Next Gen movies or the original series movies. Kirk and Spock are written well, they're developed well, they're featured extensively. The rest of the cast really get short shrifted, and especially McCoy. And I will admit, Leonard McCoy is my favorite of the original triumvirate of 3 characters. I love Leonard McCoy, and he's wasted in this. And the only minor original series cast member who gets a good showing, and even that's pretty minimal, is Captain Sulu.
Yeah, I think in 6 we finally get the Sulu that we've been waiting for, right? And they have to do this for a couple different reasons. They've got to move. They've got to create space to have Kim Cattrall's character be the turncoat in the film. And you definitely, it's like there was this validation in seeing Sulu as captain of the superior ship, the Excelsior, which was thrilling. I love the design of Excelsior. I can't get over it. It reminded me of if the Enterprise is a frigate, then the Excelsior is a ship of the line. That's kind of what it reminded me of. It's just this big, huge ass, badass ship, which I always dug. I also felt like at the time and I remember being a kid, right, when the Generations comes out, it felt to me like the studio didn't trust the audience enough to watch a Star Trek Next Generation film. So we're going to put Shatner into it. Let's ham these old, oh, look, it's a Star Trek movie. It's got Star Trek people in it. It's like they didn't trust the audience. They didn't trust the audience to go and see it enough. And getting back to your point, can we talk a little bit about the on-screen chemistry between, say, Shatner versus, the world? I had always read that Shatner was not well liked by the cast. Thoughts on this at all? I mean, because this kind of comes out in Galaxy Quest, which skewers Star Trek, and beautifully so.
No. Wrong. Jason, Galaxy Quest is the stealth contender for top 3 Star Trek film.
Is it? Okay.
It is a Star Trek film. I will take no questions. It is a Star Trek film. Yeah.
Well, that's good because it's coming up on the HATM Sunday night schedule like in 2 weeks.
Yay.
So, all right. So, Shatner.
So I think the thing about Shatner is that, obviously I think many of us have read the stories about his friction with, say, George Takei in particular, which still continues to this day. With Leonard Nimoy, I mean, they reconciled just before I think Nimoy passes away, but Shatner still expresses regret about that because he said that, I think he said on more than one occasion that he felt he could have done more to really strengthen their friendship before Nimoy passed away. And I think even thinking about going back to the previous question about how the original series cast is treated in 6, the most frustrating part of the film, and I guess this is minuses for the movie, is how Uhura is portrayed in the movie in terms of her not knowing Klingon.
They really miss on her.
Really, and Nichelle Nichols herself actually said that she told Mayer and the others and the producers on the film that she felt that scene didn't make any sense. It made her character look bad, which it really did. That she is the communications officer. She's been that for this long, and she doesn't know Klingon. It's and I think it's an example of 2 things. Number one, how Nichols was always criminally underused in the movies and the television show. Mm-hmm. But secondly, it also shows how Star Trek, really from, I suppose, 4 on, you see in Star Trek films attempts at forced humor that often backfire and they don't work. And the films that back away from that don't do it as much, tended to do better. But you see that from 4 on, these attempts at, we're going to insert humor in these movies and moments that doesn't make any sense or it kind of hurts the character development, that sort of thing. But going back to your question about Shatner, ironically enough, I think him having fiction with the cast kind of helps in Star Trek 6 because he is the captain. At times, we think a captain in Star Trek, they treat a captain as being the crew's friend, but in real life, that's not usually the case. Usually the captain is the guy who's like, okay, you got to do this. These are your orders. Go and execute them. And I think in 6, what you see is that Kirk has built a rapport with the crew, with the original series crew, which is, I guess, why Valeris has to be the one who is the turncoat, played by Kim Cattrall.
It's worth noting that in the original treatment, Meyer wanted to make Saavik, the character he created, the turncoat, and Roddenberry didn't like that. And the actress in question had an asking price that was a little too expensive. So Kim Cattrall gets a great opportunity prior to Sex and the City.
Who's the actress in question? You can't just do that.
Kirstie Alley.
Oh, okay. The second.
Kirstie Alley. Her first film was Star Trek II, and she's in Cheers. She is a very powerful, in-demand actress, and she was asking more than DeForest Kelley would have been paid for the film, and the producers were not willing to do that.
But her character was replaced in 3, or the actress was replaced in 3, who I actually liked more than Kirstie Alley.
Mm-hmm.
Version of Saavik, actually. And I was actually, I can't recall her name. I'm sure you guys probably know. I actually liked her very much.
Robin Curtis,
in 3. I felt like Saavik was just too wooden, I guess, in 2 to me.
Yeah.
I mean, Vulcans are, logical, but they're not without some level of personality. And I felt like I was looking earlier, I was like, what happened to Robin Curtis? She was great. She was great in 3. Like, I very much liked her. I kind of wish we had seen the character at some point in time, even on board the Superior Excelsior.
Oh, Jason, it got written out, but around the setting of 4, she was supposed to have been pregnant with Spock's child.
Oh, but she's way younger.
Yeah. And and that's an interesting, could have been that wasn't explored.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. We all agree that like Nichelle Nichols' Uhura was really poorly treated in 6, and it felt like a major point of the new iteration of the what do we call this? The Pine series. The I don't know the correct term here, but for the Chris Pine Star Trek series.
If you're a hater, it's JJ Trek. Sorry.
JJ Trek. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Kelvin verse films, you know.
Kelvin
Yes,
verse.
Kelvin. That's the
Kelvin
right
verse.
term.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's go Kelvin verse. Because it feels like her character has replaced DeForest Kelly's, doctor, has replaced Bones as like as the third member of that like holy trilogy, trinity of Star Trek characters. And now it's Kirk and it's Spock and it's Uhura, and Bones is kind of out there a little bit. I love Carl Urban. I don't know how I feel about his portrayal of Bones. Can we talk a little bit about Uhura in the new series? Like how do we feel about that role?
I think for one, I like how she's portrayed because in Star Trek Into Darkness, she actually knows Klingon. So that's a great improvement off the bat. But I also think this actually shows how there are more. So let me backtrack for a second. I think with Nichelle Nichols' place in Star Trek, it's always really interesting because on the one hand, she is always held up as a pioneer in not just science fiction, but American television, as being a Black woman on a weekly television series who wasn't a maid, wasn't just answering the phone. But on the flip side, you go back and watch the original series, and there are many episodes where she's really just in the background. She may have a few lines here or there. Ironically enough, if you watch Uhura in season 1, I think that's actually some of her best stuff because she's actually doing a lot. She's actually not just working as a communications officer. She's actually showing her engineering chops, that kind of thing. And we don't really get that much in the movies. Now, with the Kelvinverse movies, I think they really hone in on Uhura more to show a more diverse side of Star Trek and to also kind of subvert the audience's expectations of who's going to be the big dog, so to speak, in those movies.
One of the places the Kelvinverse films, does better, the original series Triangle, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, it's very male.
Yeah.
And yet in that aspirational universe, we're talking about, people from different backgrounds, different genders working together, but we're not it's a show from the 1960s. And so they speak to it, but they don't always live up to it. And the Kelvinverse and, more recently produced Star Trek shows, they are living the values, that the sort of infinite diversity, infinite combinations, world is very real in, currently produced Star Trek shows.
I want to get back to Shatner, and I want to talk about Kirk because there's no Star Trek without Kirk.
Yeah.
I already know Rob's answer on this because I've seen him post too many times, but the audience doesn't know. I want to know your favorite captains in Star Trek lore. And why?
I'll let Robert go first.
Well, okay. So I have to say my favorite captain is Benjamin Sisko. And here's why. I think for one, Avery Brooks' portrayal of Sisko is incredible. Not just for Star Trek, but for television in the 1990s. I always harp on the fact that if you think about television in the 90s, again, basing this in the history of American entertainment at that time, he is one of the few portrayals of a Black single father on television. And I think that's a big deal. Now, I will say, growing up in the 90s as a young man with a 2-parent home, who was living the Black experience in the 1990s, it meant something to see Sisko in a Star Trek show. It meant something to see him in the lead, but also it meant something to see him as both a war hero on the one hand, as you see in Deep Space Nine, a pioneer, a religious icon for the Bajoran people, but also to see him as a dad. He's kidding his son Jake about dating girls on Deep Space Nine, making dinner for the crew, that kind of thing. I would argue that Sisko, out of all the captains that we've seen in Trek, I think is, maybe there's some debate with Picard and the recent Picard series, but I think Sisko is the most fully realized of the captains in the sense of how they portray his personal life and all of that. And I think a big part of that is the setting of the show, being on a space station where they're just living out their day-to-day lives and that kind of thing. So for me, it's Sisko. I have no least favorite captain, but my favorite one is definitely Sisko.
And my answer, Jason, is going to be really similar, but I'm going to have it all the ways. And Benjamin Sisko, William Riker, Carol Freeman, and Michael Burnham.
Oh, wow.
And why? As captains, their families are part of their development. And so this, to Robert's point, so they're fuller people, and the relationships between Ben and Jake Sisko, Carol Freeman, and Beckett Mariner make the characters better, the shows stronger and more interesting. And again, before I had kids, I probably looked at it differently. The other thing, thinking about captains and leadership, as a senior leader in a present day aspirational federal bureaucracy, the lens I find deep meaning in Star Trek is, I watch it for what it says about leadership. And, the Next Generation really stresses this collaborative listening leadership. And again, in season 3 of Picard, that is returned in force, and it's remarkable to see. The first 2 years of the original series, Kirk is occasionally on fire, and Shatner does really good, in sort of meditating briefly on the burdens of being a leader and having the fate of the ship, the fate of the galaxy, the fate of the crew in your hands. And through this lens, may I recommend the following 2 episodes of Star Trek. The original series episode, Balance of Terror, which is among the best Cold War episodes. And then the Strange New Worlds first season, Ender, Equality of Mercy. I'm not giving too much away. Those 2 episodes riff on the same story and contrast Kirk and Pike's leadership styles in a way that, again, makes both episodes really compelling to watch. And
that was a really tense episode of Strange New Worlds.
Yeah.
Because without revealing, because I don't want to ruin, I feel like everything's fair when it comes to Star Trek, a film that's 30 some odd years old. With Strange New Worlds, I know a lot of folks haven't maybe come to it yet, although I had said before, prior to Andor coming out, I had said that I just thought it was the best Star Trek. I mean, best Star Trek, best Star Wars, best Star Trek or Star Wars we'd seen on film since 1983. I think Strange New Worlds is that good. I love it. I think it's phenomenal. Both of you are wrong on your captains, however. It's obviously Anson Mount's Christopher Pike, who has the greatest, most interesting hair of any Starfleet captain. There's a lot of hair product going on. I love what he's done with the character. I think, and of course, Pike, as a lot of people know, like there's bad news coming, and I think that's like with the interesting part of the show was like there's like this ticking clock. When is Kirk going to show up? When does the Enterprise make this transition from Pike? And of course, when do things happen that are important to both Pike's life and the Star Trek universe as well? I think that they're doing a phenomenal job balancing all of this and also striking this amazing line of like humor.
And to build on that, Jason, the other thing that Strange New Worlds is doing well is the minor characters who traditionally got screwed. Uhura is in Strange New Worlds, and she's incredible. And probably the most important original series, one of 2 female characters in the original series who really, really got hosed are Yeoman Janice Rand and Nurse Christine Chapel. And Christine Chapel in Strange New Worlds is built out as a human being, a full person, not just a woman in a short skirt. And thank God.
Yeah, I love what they're doing. Let's bring it back to Undiscovered Country. What's the weaknesses of this film? We've been kind of hinting at some of them throughout the film. I think we all agree that it does a really cool job of making these allusions to the Cold War ending, at the same time grappling with the natural process of aging. Right? It's really trying to do 3 different things. It's doing this Cold War allegory. It's talking about very real ideas of like, hey, we were once young people on this goddamn spaceship moving through space and time, and space and time are catching up with us now. And it also has to send everybody off in a way that is satisfying to arguably the most rabid fan base in all of pop culture.
Surely you do.
Although my Star Wars fans would argue, since we don't like anything.
Yeah.
Where are the missteps in 6?
Something that doesn't do a lot for me personally. I talked about how 6 features physical starship models, but there is some CGI in the film, and that's in the assassination sequence. To today's standard, it's really funny. It's barely anything, but it's fairly graphic for 1991. There's Klingon blood spurting out, floating in little zero-G globules.
Yeah.
And for me, okay, sure, but and that's a very minor nitpick. The weakness that we've been talking about for like 10 or 15 minutes is, again, minor characters just do not get the time in the storytelling they deserve.
I would say weaknesses in 6. I think there are 2. And again, this is one of my favorite Trek films. But one, the film does look a bit cheaper in comparison to other Star Trek films. If you go back and, let's say you watch 6 and then you watch Generations, come out 3 years later, you can tell which one has the bigger budget. There are times when you watch 6, and I think in a way it also helps the film because they had to pare back everything, so it's a bit more bare bones. But 6 does look cheaper. Not necessarily it's a cheap film. It just, the aesthetics are a bit cheaper than other Star Trek films. But second, build off of Eric's point, but in a different way about minor characters, I think the second weakness is what they cut out of the film. And namely, if you watch Star Trek 6 and you watch the director's cut of 6, there's a whole subplot they cut out where you find out that the conspiracy of the Klingon start a war includes a Starfleet element, which happens to include Rene Aubernois, who plays Odo in Deep Space Nine and play other characters. He plays Colonel West, who is working for Starfleet. At one point in the film, he designs a plan to rescue Kirk and McCoy from Rural Pentay, the Klingon gulag in space. That whole thing is cut out, and you find that he also was the guy who was going to kill the Federation president at the end of the film. They cut that entire subplot out to the point where Renee's not even in the movie, in the theatrical version. But I saw it as a kid. I saw the director's cut, and I thought he was always in it. The irony there, again, sledgehammer as allegory, his name is Colonel West. Clear allegory, clear play on Oliver North and the Iran-Contra scandal. So the film, it's a Cold War allegory, but it's also, in a lot of ways, if you take that Cold War allegory, you follow through with it, you're saying the Klingons are the Soviet Union and the Federation is the United States. It's pointing out that the Federation/US has its unsavory elements too that are also trying to foment war, and yet that part is really cut out of the film.
How do we feel about Rural Pentay? I felt like the film kind of drags when they get to the prison planet.
Well, they're depending on the forced humor that Robert talked about a little bit. There's some good physical gags.
The knee hit.
Yeah, but
not everyone has their genitals in the same place.
Yeah.
One thing I always felt where Star Trek suffered, and I know we probably have to make this comparison in a second, but one of the things I always felt like it suffered when it comes to, say, Star Trek versus Star Wars was the physical creature development on screen, where it's like, it never felt like with Star Trek, like the characters looked as crisp or as real for some reason. So the guy who gets the knee punch, it looks like a guy wearing a mask to me. I always struggled with this. That, and as well as like the inability through time, guys, if I've got a complaint, it's the inability through time to figure out what a Klingon looks like. And this goes all the way to our current day. I get initially, like, you can only do so much on the 1960s television show on CBS. But the radical redesign of a Klingon through time now, Christopher Plummer barely even looks like a Klingon in this film. His Chang is like got a couple bumps on his head, but otherwise I'm like, he's just got bad acne.
So I think I've read before, and I need to verify this, but I'm pretty sure that when Christopher Plummer agreed to play Chang, one of his few conditions was that he didn't want the heavy Klingon makeup. And so they kind of pare back on that for him. But I think there is something to be said about how the Klingon design has always changed through time as a reflection of how Star Trek itself is always evolving over time. So for example, if you're thinking about these films and you're thinking about history in Hollywood for a moment, go back and look at the novelization of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which was written by Gene Roddenberry. And Roddenberry in that novel, he actually basically says, to placate fans in the 70s that were concerned about how much the design of the Enterprise had changed and all so forth between the original series and the motion picture, Roddenberry in the book basically says, the original series was a dramatization of those events as you would have seen them in the 23rd century. So when you think about how, going back to the Klingon question for a second, there's this long-standing feud amongst Trek fans about canon and what's canon and what belongs in television and what counts and what doesn't count. I think Star Trek as a franchise, if you're thinking about it historically based, one of its most important contributions is this idea of what fandom means and what is counted as entertainment. And they've been dealing with that from the 60s onward. So the Klingon question, I think, is hilarious. I've always wanted to make a Star Trek episode, no matter what show it was, where we see every possible Klingon design and then just say, that's just what we look like. And just never answer that question. Like, just have Worf say, we do not discuss this with outsiders, like he did in Trials and Tribulations in 96.
I bet you before Lower Decks is done, they'll do that, Robert.
Well, we know that we've got a Lower Decks Strange New Worlds collaboration coming soon.
I can't wait.
Which I don't know how they're
going
to pull that off, but that's going to be phenomenal. Let me ask you this. Is it fair to compare Star Trek and Star Wars?
I would say no, and it's understandable at the same time.
Yeah.
I say no because, and I love both. I love both franchises, but I think it's no because Star Wars is more of a space fantasy. Yeah. Star Trek is more of, it's soft science fiction, but it's still science fiction. But I think the comparisons are understandable. And to build off the theme of the night, both franchises have had such a long lineage, partly because they reflect real world issues. Where Star Trek, has the allegory about the Soviets and the Americans and such. Star Wars, you think Empire versus Rebels, right? You think the use of a jungle planet or forest planet, Return of the Jedi, as a metaphor for Vietnam, things like that. These franchises are different, but we can't help but compare them. And right. I think that's a testament to their strength as franchises.
Yeah, well, and a recent episode of Star Trek Picard reminded, the big difference is part of Star Trek and the conceit of Star Trek, that aspirational universe is Star Trek occasionally pauses and looks at the universe with wonder, and Star Wars is not interested in that. And that's not a criticism because, again, Rogue One and Empire Strikes Back and Andor, when Star Wars is doing Star Wars, it's incredible. When they play to their strengths, both parts of the genre reflect really great storytelling.
All right. There's been a crap ton of Star Trek films at this point in time. Instead of ranking all of them, let's go top 3, bottom 3.
Well, Jason, are you just doing original series?
No. I want original series, the Kelvin verse, the next generation stuff. Absolutely.
That's easy. 632, Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, and then the bottom would be Nemesis, Final Frontier, and the very, 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 very bottom is the execrable Star Trek Into Darkness.
Wow.
It's a terrible film.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have discovered that Eric Leonard does not like the Kelvinverse.
The first film's not bad, and Beyond is okay, but Into Darkness was the laziest, most insulting fan service I've ever seen. It was stupid.
Okay, we have to pause. Why? Why is Into Darkness so bad? And Rob literally just put his hands behind his like he's like digging in on this, like ready to listen to Eric go, which is awesome. What? I need to know in a series of in a pod about a completely different movie. We need to talk about why this movie sucks.
Yeah.
Why is
Well,
Into Darkness bad? Oh, wait.
'cause-
Oh, I know. It's because you blow up the Enterprise again. That's right. We can't. The Enterprise is this awesome ship that can't actually be a ship. It's usually being a part.
Yeah.
Is that why?
Well,
That
no,
drives me nuts.
it's they thought they were being clever by repeating the Star Trek II story and flipping parts of it. And I've seen that movie and I like it very much. I don't need to see it cheated on. And it was insulting. It was a waste of those actors. It was a waste of a lot of money that went into special effects and production and advertising. It was just insulting. Beyond is better, but Into Darkness, I do not physically own a copy of that film. And as a Star Trek fan, if I don't have in some cases, like 3 different copies, that tells you how I feel about it. And no,
look, I won't let my kids watch The Last Jedi. So yeah, I feel you.
There you go. Absolutely. Robert, your turn.
Well, okay. So my 3 favorite films. I think one choice might be controversial. I have to say, Star Trek 2, 6, and the motion picture. And
no, that's okay.
I know the motion picture is controversial for a lot of fans, but here's why I say that. I think if you're talking about Star Trek films in terms of how they most match up to Roddenberry's original vision of Star Trek, of a story about exploration, wonder, and really pushing the boundaries of the final frontier, in a way the motion picture does that arguably the best among the original 6 films. Now, with that said, there's a caveat there, because Eric mentioned earlier how you have this tradition in Trek films of a big bad villain. The motion picture starts a tradition of we got to save Earth in the movies that you see a bunch of times. Also, the motion picture dreams of a far more robust American space program than we've ever actually had with Voyager 6, which actually, again, allegory and all that, it takes advantage of the craze about the Voyager probes in the late 1970s. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, the motion picture, before I go on to the least favorite Trek films, the motion picture does something that I think is very much 1970s, in that in the brief moments where they portray the entire crew of the Enterprise, it is really diverse. As in, they show indigenous peoples in the crew. They show people from around the world, from different Federation worlds, in a way they couldn't or just didn't do in the original series. Now, most of those characters are just in the background, but it does show at least an attempt at diversity that you kind of see more and more of in the 1970s. You think this is in the 70s with entertainment in DC and Marvel Comics. You have the rise of Black Panther in Marvel. DC has various minority characters as well. You kind of sort of see it. By the way, a great place to see this is actually in Star Trek comics in the 70s, where they start introducing more characters of very diverse backgrounds. With that said, the least favorite Trek films for me, and again, I enjoy all Trek films. If they're on television, I will turn to any of them except Insurrection.
Nemesis.
Oh. Insurrection is my least favorite film. For me, it's Insurrection, it's Generations, and then it is probably Nemesis. And I hate to rag on the TNG crew. It's not their fault. It's just that the team, going back to Eric's point and Jason's point as well about how this is a movie, a show franchise versus a film franchise. The Next Generation television series worked. It was a great series.
Yeah, loved it.
But the thing is, what made it great was it was an ensemble cast. The movies got away from that very quickly, and the movies decided we're going to make Captain Picard as much of an action hero as possible. And again, I love Patrick Stewart, don't get me wrong, but those films at times, they were just missing a few elements. I think that's
what made the Star Trek. So I remember going to my dad's house, and my dad was like this big buff, like manly man guy, right? This hunter fisherman guy, but he loved watching Star Trek Next Generation, right? And I remember going to his house, and I remember the very first time watching the show. Sorry, but that was actually me. It turns out. I remember watching for the very first time, and I didn't see Picard, right? The very first guy I saw was Riker. So I just thought, oh, this guy looks like Shatner. This guy looks like Kirk. He must be the captain. I remember thinking this when I'm like a 10-year-old, right? I'm like, oh, this guy's got the look. He's the handsome guy. He's got the look. He kind of looks like Shatner. Clearly, he's the captain. And then this bald guy shows up, and he's not like the captain at all. He's not like I thought that's what made Next Generation work so well, was that you've got a completely different dude as captain. Kirk is a fighter, Picard much more of a thinker. And then I think, if there was anything, Riker was kind of an amalgam of the two. That's why. So when you say that, they made like Stewart an action star, that's not his role. He's playing chess. That was kind of always the way I saw him.
But I think, to your point, that's actually the issue with the Star Trek movies. And Chris Pine himself has commented on this recently, that Pine has actually said Paramount needs to stop trying to make $1 billion off the Star Trek film and let it breathe on its own as a Star Trek film and have more modest expectations for what it can make at the box office.
Just be a good Star Trek movie.
Yeah, the Covenverse films have tried to be blockbusters, and I enjoy Star Trek. I enjoy Beyond. I thought Into Darkness was okay, but I do agree that I think it just kind of did some recycling of certain elements. Is why it didn't work. It was like, we're going to make Star Trek 2, but worse. It's like, well, why did you do that? But I think with the Next Generation films, and again, this is a reflection of Hollywood and where it is in the 1990s and early aughts, the writers for Generations even admitted that they were just exhausted writing 7 seasons of Next Generation. Yeah, and they literally went from doing that to Generations, and they had no break. Whereas, with 6, I think you can tell they really took time. You said Meyer and Nimoy figured out the basic outline pretty quickly, but you can tell they took the idea of this being their final film seriously. They knew they could not mess this up. This was their last chance to get it right.
We haven't talked about First Contact tonight. We haven't said First Contact a single time tonight. We haven't talked about the Borg.
On that note, next week is First Contact Day, the anniversary of the first contact with aliens in what, at this point, 40 years, less than. We're under 40 years to First Contact in 2061.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. All we have to do is endure a third world war in the process. So.
Yeah.
Good times.
Yeah.
Give it time. What do we think about First Contact? Are we fans? We've skipped completely over it.
So I used to really love First Contact, and actually I still enjoy it to this day. I think there are parts of it where it kind of bogs down. But what I find interesting about First Contact to me, and this is again relates to the point of the theme of the show tonight, is that where 6 is about the allegory of the Cold War, I think First Contact is about hero worship in history. Yeah. And how the characters, they meet Zefram Cochrane. They're like, Zefram Cochrane's our hero.
Oh my God,
even
this guy.
No spoilers, but the Picard series kind of goes back to this joke about a statue of Zefram Cochrane, right? And having the statue. They meet Cochrane, and they're all, the folks who meet him are initially unimpressed. They're shocked by what he's actually like. And then they realize this is what makes him a hero, is that he's a regular guy who just wants to make money, and he stumbles into history and decides, okay, this is actually pretty important. I think there's actually a lesson there for how people should think about men and women in history, that these people were flesh and blood human beings who were not perfect by any means, but they made history because of their humanity, not in spite of it.
There is a Cold War allegory in First Contact, that the Phoenix is built on an intercontinental ballistic missile. And, there's this amazing scene between Picard and Data where they talk about it. And there's, again, to the hero worship, being next to the vehicle is a big deal to Picard. And Data's like, yeah, I can see the imperception. The metal is fatiguing and there's these problems. And for the record, I've been to the Titan Missile Museum. I've touched the same spot, and oh my God, it was amazing. let me plug the Titan Missile Museum south of Tucson, Arizona, as one of two intercontinental ballistic sites that feature both control centers and nuclear missiles with no fuel, no warhead in their silos. The Titan II is the big one, and it's an absolutely massive missile in a very big space. It's worth the trip to go to because that technology now feels old, but it was prepared to launch missiles into space across, over the North Pole and, end human civilization as we know it. And we ought to talk about that. I digress.
I want to talk about a gap in Star Trek.
Oh, please.
You've got TNG. You've got Deep Space Nine going on towards the end of TNG, correct?
Yeah.
And then you've got Voyager. Yeah. And then there's like a pause, and then there's Enterprise. And I don't know what to make of Enterprise. And it seems like Enterprise just didn't work. I never bought
I love Enterprise. It's not a great show. What I like about Enterprise is it's set so, still in the future, but it's set, in the 2150s. That's like 100, that's now less than 150 years from now.
It's not far.
Our grandkids.
Right.
It's like our great grandkids. And also, to get really nerdy for a minute, at the very front end of the pilot episode of Enterprise, the Starfleet admiral that mispronounces Klingon, that character's name is Daniel Leonard. That's my dad's name. So, ladies and gentlemen, my family's been canonized, and I will. I'm going to go to my grave. Really impressed about that. Where Enterprise fails is it got stuck in the post 9/11 world, and it tries to use that allegory, and it sledgehammers it in really bad ways.
Yeah, I think with just to add to what Eric just mentioned there about Enterprise, I think there are a couple things about Enterprise. Number one, the premise of the show was Rick Berman and Brannon Braga, who were the showrunners, who were basically in charge of Trek at that point. They were trying to craft a fresh take on Trek after doing TNG, DS9, and Voyager, all set in the 24th century. And they thought, well, let's go back to the 22nd century and do a prequel. The problem they faced was, for one thing, the UPN execs were a bit iffy about the idea. In fact, Braga and Berman have both said their original idea for Enterprise was to set the entire first season just on Earth and to show them building to a point where they build the Enterprise and go out into space. They quickly realized, you could do that now, but in 2001, the UPN execs were like, no, we got to show a Star Trek show in space. Right. But secondly, I think Eric's exactly right. They suffered from being a post 9/11 show and really leaning into that allegory in ways that were even distasteful at the time, like namely use of torture and the like to get information in season 3. But also, the show didn't really feel like a prequel at times until season 4, when they finally lean into by the way, we should show how the Federation is formed and how they first have battle with the Romulans and so on and so forth. But by that point, it was too late. And I think, Jason, to your point, the premise of Enterprise and the premise of Voyager, going back to Voyager as well, they're really intriguing premises that just maybe they were too ahead of their time in terms of the writing staffs, etc., weren't willing to take the kind of risk to make those shows actually work. Whereas now, I think if Paramount Plus was doing a Voyager Enterprise show, they could maybe do more with those premises than they did back 20, 25 years ago.
Well, and now to plug, there was a science fiction show in the post 9/11 world that got the War on Terror right, and that's Battlestar Galactica.
One of the best series of all time.
Yeah,
just an incredible show. It feels to me like you guys are talking about this, though. Like, one of the overarching themes of Star Trek is actually this meta theme that, like, the producers don't trust the films. They don't trust this series, it feels like at times. It's going back to this idea that stop trying to make Star Trek into Star Wars. In other words, when a Star Wars movie comes out, it's got a realistic shot of being the biggest film of all time, right? Star Trek doesn't do that, and therefore that shouldn't be the goal. I like Star Trek as a thinking man's science fiction, or a thinking person's science fiction, with hope, right? I think that what do you think? Star Wars set in the past, Star Trek was always like, hey, if we get our shit together, this is what this could be. There'll still be
Right.
problems, but in this better world, that was the allure. All right, let's bring this back to our final question here. Star Trek VI, Undiscovered Country. Is this a history movie?
Yes, both in the allegorical sense, but now 30 years later, I mean, the film ties a bow on that original series and pivots to the creative stuff that was starting to happen that's been built on, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. And the universe now is 60 years old. Canon is often contradictory. The various franchises always reflect, the time they're made. 6 is successful because it uses the contemporary politics of that moment to pivot from the original series setting toward the next generation. And so it's respectful in that respect of both the original series and what was being done at the time. This film is different than the other original series films and those that come after it because of that.
I would say that it is a history film because of the reasons Eric laid out. And I think because of the fact that it is part of a quintessential trope of science fiction of using allegory to say something about the society in which folks live in. And again, 6, I think, is beloved for that reason. It is Star Trek at its best when it uses allegory. Although I think it's also not the only Trek film that deals with history. That's a
4, obviously.
Of the time. Well, 4 definitely. I think First Contact with how it deals with history
Memory.
And thinking about memory versus history. But yeah, I think 6 is certainly a history film. And it's one that, funny enough, I think about how the film is looked at now with current Russia-U.S. tensions. The fact that it comes out at the very end of the Cold War is such an interesting idea that it's the last word on the Cold War. Because as folks have pointed out, it comes out in November of 91. The Soviet Union disappears just over a month later.
And a strength, Robert, is in between 91 and the, like 1994, there's this moment where we're all optimistic. Francis Fukuyama says, we're at the end of history. Liberal democracy has won. And within the drama of Star Trek VI, they're showing that, yes, the evil empire in space might break up, but it's not going to be simple. People will be people, and they're going to fight for advantage. And that's interesting. It sets up some great drama, and that's one of the things I appreciate about it.
Well, that's awesome, guys. Thank you so much. Just to be able to sit here and talk to this, I don't think I had an appreciation for this film until I talked to you guys about it, about you guys wanting to watch this thing. And of course, I went back and rewatched this morning with a whole new set of eyes on it. And then listening to you guys break it down amongst this whole other world that we're talking about. I feel like we could do an entire series on Star Trek on these pods. And, but guys, thank you so much for being here tonight. I cannot thank you enough. Where can people find you guys on Twitter?
Well, I'm the handle Rob Greene 2 or Rob Greene II on Twitter. I'm pretty easy to find. And
I'm Freebodar, which I won't explain.
I've
on
heard
Twitter. Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for being here.
This is fun.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Robert Greene II and Eric Leonard. Thank you guys so much. I cannot wait to have you back on the pod. Do some more Star Trek. We'll do anything you guys want to talk about. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell. And you can find me as well at Herbert History. If you want to learn more about HATM, this is your first time coming to the pod, you can find us on Twitter. You can look for the hashtag HATM. There's an Instagram page. A lot of you guys have been asking, what films have we done on Sunday nights? You can always find that on the Instagram page. And there's a website coming soon as well. So keep your eyes open for Historians of the Movies podcast or historiansofthemovies.com. That's being refreshed as we speak. So I hope you're having a great time. Thank you so much for being part of this community. Absolutely live for it. So thank you so much. Cannot wait to talk to you again. Talk to you soon. Ciao for now.